Welcome to the panel room. I'm Jason, and today we are covering historical fiction for a modern audience. Before we get started with the questions, though, let's go around the room and have everyone introduce themselves. And we'll start with you, David.
Hi, my name is David B. Coe. I also write as D.B. Jackson. I have been writing fantasy for 25 years or so professionally. I am on this panel because I have a PhD in history and I have written extensively in historical fiction. I'm best known probably for the Thief Taker series and historical urban fantasy set in pre-revolutionary Boston that I write under the D.B. Jackson pseudonym. These are mysteries with a historical angle. And I also last year wrote a novelization for the Nightfall series done by the History Channel, which was a briefly lived show about the Knights Templar. Anyway, so that's me.
All right, perfect. Piper.
Hi, I'm Piper Huguley. I specialize in, I've been writing historical romance based on particular events in Black history. One series is based on the founding of a fictitious historically Black college. And another series is about my family's history, or is based on my family's history in regards to the Great Migration. And I'm beginning to enter into writing biographical historical fiction about unknown Black women.
All right, perfect. Nancy.
I'm Nancy Northcott. I write science fiction and several subgenres of romance, but my current project is the War King's Honor historical fantasy trilogy for Falstaff Books. And I'm pretty much a lifelong history geek, love social history, love to read it, and enjoy doing the research for the books.
Okay, perfect. And Tamsin.
Hi, I'm Tamsin Silver, and I am an author with Falstaff Books. I have a new series with them, the Untold Legends series. You can see book 1 and 2 here. Book 3 will come out in, thanks David, I appreciate it. They will come out in 2021. The third book, The Murder of Cricket Kugler, will come out. And these books take place in 2 different time periods in history. Mostly, I do a lot of research on, and I'm wearing a picture of him actually, of Billy the Kid in the Lincoln County War in 1878. But I also in these books explore history in 1949 New Mexico as well.
Jean Marie.
Hi, my name's Jean Marie Ward. I write fiction, nonfiction, and everything in between. I'm an enormous history nerd, and from the fiction standpoint, I write about a dragon in 1421 Ming era China during the Yongle period with Shang Hua and a lot of other really interesting characters. I have a series that is set, a series about that I describe as sorcerer versus sorcerer transplanted from our day to 1938 New York. And finally, the most intensively researched historical piece I have is a novella in Tales from the Vatican Vaults, which is called Cooking Up a Storm, set in Washington, D.C., the day the British burned the Capitol.
Perfect. Finally, Mark.
Hi, I'm Mark Williams, and I'm among all you guys here, I'm the one that doesn't write anything. I'm a lifelong history guy in terms of amateurish, and starting in my mid-teens, began to study the sort of popular street fiction, popular literature of the late 19th century, and closing out a 50-year recording career as an engineer and producer, I've created a small publishing company where I can take the many, many hundreds of these things I've read over the years and sort of curate them down to some that I think are actually pretty palatable to a modern audience. So I have just turned in the 14th book to KDP. I've got 10 in one series, a very early detective series that began in 1878. The Joe Phoenix series, published originally by Beatles. And I've got a few others, and I've got basically 3 series going out. There's the Joe series. There's another series called Gilded Age Detective Stories, which is same author, Albert Aiken, and then a third series, which is the unadorned action stuff. That's Steam Age crime stories. So anyway, so that's what I do. I guess I'm a packaging guy. I'm curating and packaging these things, and that's what I do. If you want to find out my what it's really about, I would say the easiest thing would be to search Dark Lantern Tales in quotes, and you'll find all my website stuff.
All right, perfect. Thank you. So let's go ahead and jump right in. I'll start with you, Piper. What drew you to writing historical fiction?
One of the things whenever I teach United States literature on a college level, and in one of my classes, one of the assigned essay pieces is called "The Need for Heroes" by Langston Hughes, and it's an essay. Hughes is more known for his poetry than his essays, but he writes brilliant essays, and it's an essay where he was feeling very frustrated about the fact that in 1941, when he published the essay, that there were very few examples of biographical historical fiction that showed Black people in a positive light. And unfortunately, here we are many, many decades later on, coming into, what is that? Not a math person, the 80th anniversary of that article. And it's only beginning to foment into the publication of these stories that showcase Black people doing heroic things and not just being rendered invisible. My students kind of like the stuff I brought out, and I thought maybe if it got them to reading more, which is a thing for these youngsters coming up in Generation Z, that maybe if I wrote these things down and encouraged others to do the same, that they would find some kind of learning, edification, inspiration in these stories.
All right, perfect. Nancy, how about you?
Well, when I was 7 or 8 years old, I saw this program on the Wonderful World of Disney called When Knighthood Was in Flower. And it was what I now realize was a highly fictionalized account of Charles Brandon and Henry Tudor's sister, Mary, who had been Queen of France. And that kind of got me interested in English history. And I majored in it in school and have always read history. And so when I started writing romance initially, I thought, well, I mean, you can't beat the flash and dash of a guy in shining armor with a sword. And so it kind of moved on from there. And then I discovered the controversy surrounding Richard III and his reputation. And I've been deep diving in that for probably 30 years now. And so it was just kind of natural to take those things and my love of English history and kind of shuffle them all in together. And so that's what I've done.
Okay. Tamsin?
I was busy writing urban fantasy when historical fantasy smacked me in the face. I really wanted to get involved with an anthology. I wasn't in any at the time. And Misty Massey and a group were doing one called Doing Weird Westerns. And I was like, I can do that. I'll try. What do I know about the West? Nothing. Let me see. And so I looked and I was like, oh yeah, Billy the Kid. I know all about that. I went on and I started digging, and I discovered this whole murder plot that was wrapped around how Billy ended up, like what started the inciting incident of how Billy ended up becoming so famous. And it's the man he was working for was murdered with him there, and him choosing to try and right that wrong for the rest of his life, as short as it was. And so the minute I realized that there was this murder, and then everyone covered this up, and there was all this, I got down the rabbit hole, and I just started going, well, what if I added fantasy to it? And it just grew from there. And I wrote a short story and submitted it, and they loved it so much they turned it down. They did. They said, we think this is really great. It's a great voice, it's a great idea, but we think this is a book. And I said, I agree. And so they turned it down. And so I worked on it, and it's now going to be 3 books instead of 1 because I'm long-winded. And so it's so how I got into it. I came out to New Mexico, and because I lived in New York City at the time, and I just started researching and walking the land and fell in love with New Mexico, and I live here now. So when I say it smacked me in the face, that's my polite version.
All right, Jean Marie.
Okay, well, I don't know a time when I wasn't aware of history as a enormous font of stories. But the idea that I wanted to write historical fiction or fiction that had history in it, but somehow it always had magic, I think derived from 2 sources, one being Dracula, and the second, and probably the most important, being Raphael Sabatini. Raphael Sabatini was a writer of historical fiction in the early 20th century. And where I grew up reading things like Dickens and Thackeray and all of the mid-19th century so-called giants of literature, and Tolstoy, who was also writing it. But I mean, God, they were turgid. And then here comes this guy who writes like these are people. And there's so much splendor all happening around because he never met a description he didn't like. And so suddenly, before I knew it, I was, checking out, did this have any historical basis? Did that have any historical basis? And wound up falling in love with Charles II. So that I kept trying to write. So far, I haven't. But it did leave me with a love of writing fiction set in history, writing secret history. And not only that, reading about Sabatini taught me how to do it.
Mark.
Well, I, as an 8-year-old, was busily reading those Hardy Boys books. And as I worked my way through the 40-odd volumes that were out in that time, I discovered that the earlier titles had verbiage that was really intriguing. Motorboats were launches, and automobiles had coupes and other things that just didn't appear in the later ones. And so I was intrigued. I also noted that the copyright dates were back in the 30s typically. So I began to look at other books and began to look at, study the writing syndicate that created all those books, and the Stratemeyer Syndicate. As I began to learn about that, I wrote to them, and his daughter replied to me. So I got to hear from her about it. I also began to realize that many of these had originated before they were bound. They had originated as what I call the street literature. Basically, if none of you have been around many dime libraries, they look like a big pamphlet, but in fact are probably a 65,000 word novel. And not all the writers had to work for hire, but they were, it was almost performance art, because most of them had to get a rough concept in mind, sit down, dip their pen in a bottle of ink, and dive in and knock out several thousand words in a day. So hacks perhaps, but they had to be a good storyteller or they wouldn't get work. So most of these are pretty well told. Some of the writers were unusually good. The writer I rely on the most, that I learned through all these studies of following the Stratemeyer stuff back to early pulp literature, was a fellow named Albert Aiken, who had a parallel career as a playwright and actor. And so all of the theatrical scenes in his books are really, really pretty great. Anyway, so I've been exploiting his stuff many years after his passing. He was gone in 1896. I do some gentle editing of the stories that began as serials or are generally a little discontinued. I guess it would be just a little jagged. So I smooth those out. I help a lot of timeline issues and that sort of thing, and to sort of make them that much more readable. I provide a glossary. I provide period illustrations, photos, and things that I include in the books, and the website has a lot of sort of contextual history to help somebody understand what's around these things. And but that's how I got into it. It was starting out like a lot of kids reading those wretched Hardy Boys books.
All right, perfect. David.
Well, so history and storytelling have been kind of the passions of my life for as long as I can remember. I wrote my first novel when I was 6 years old, and bound it myself between two pieces of construction paper with yellow yarn. And somewhere along the way, I decided to go and get a PhD in history, probably because I decided I had a better chance of making a living through the history than I would the writing of fiction. Anybody who has ever gotten a PhD in anything can tell you that at the end of a PhD program, the last thing you really want to do is spend more time studying the stuff that you just studied to get your PhD. And so when I finished my degree, I was pretty much convinced that I didn't want to do history professionally. And what I wanted to do was write fiction. So I started writing fantasy, and 11 fantasy novels later, I decided, I've gotten far enough away from history that I'm ready to bring it back into my life. And what better way to do that than to combine my two geeks, combine my love of history with my love of fantasy. And that's what I was able to do with the Thief Taker books. Originally, I wrote the first Thief Taker book as a alternate world fantasy. And my editor at Tor at the time liked the book, but basically said to me, if you could do this as a historical, we could do more with it and we could pay you more. And he wanted me to set it in London. And I said, I have no desire to set it in London, but I have a PhD in US history. Why not? How about colonial America? And that's how it ended up being set in Boston. And I was able to blend each of my murder mysteries with some specific event leading up to the revolution. And once I started playing with timelines and fitting my fiction in with actual historical events, it became just so much fun. And I wrote the 4 novels. I wrote a collection of Thief Taker short stories. I have a trilogy of Thief Taker novellas coming out this spring. I have another Thief Taker short story coming out in an anthology later this year. So I'm still doing the Thief Taker stuff, and I'm still loving it.
Perfect. So the next question.
I'm sorry, on a piece of etymology, the term thief taker is commonly used in my late 19th century books. So it's interesting that your colonial era stuff is already using that. I wonder how long back that goes.
Thief taking goes back, especially if you are in London, you can find it in the early 18th century.
Right.
The idea of thief taking existing in pre-revolutionary America is a fictional conceit for the series.
Right.
All the conditions were right for it, but it actually didn't come into being in the States until very early in the 19th century. And then it was just around for a couple of decades before established police forces made the thief taking obsolete.
Okay.
So,
thank you.
Perfect. Now,
yeah, sure.
That kind of brings up something that Mark said earlier about him having to update the books that he's working with.
Talking about me?
Needing glossaries and everything.
Oh, yeah.
So I was going to go ahead and go around and ask each of you. I'll start with you, Nancy. What do you do to make historical fiction more accessible to a modern audience?
Well, that depends on what genre I'm writing. A lot of historical romance readers don't want a lot of history in it. The history is more like background. So I tend to have people speak in a more contemporary way. and not to emphasize the history as much. Historical fantasy readers, on the other hand, love a world. I mean, you give them a world they can dive into and they're all for it. At least I am, and everybody I know who reads historical fantasy likes that. And so I tend to use more expressions from the period, more description of the way people behave. And as everybody here knows, that's kind of tricky because you don't want to go so long with description that you lose the story and you lose the action. I mean, Lord save me from Tess of the D'Urbervilles. I was scarred by that in high school and I've never gotten over it. So I try to avoid that kind of thing. But I try to build a world that is different from this one and give enough detail that people know there's somewhere that's not here. And that was most challenging for me in the third book of the trilogy because it's set in London in 1940. And I kind of assumed that life in London in 1940 was a lot like life here in 1940. Not so much. People didn't have, a lot of people out in the countryside and some people in London didn't have hot and cold running water and some of them didn't have any running water. Toilets, a lot of them were outside. So I'd given it to a friend who lives in the UK, grew up there, as did her husband. And they read it and went, no. And so that told me I have to look deeper because I'm going to have to make that understandable to people whose family probably grew up with hot and cold running water. My mother grew up in the 1930s in a house that had hot and cold running water and an indoor bathroom. My friend's husband fetched water from the town pump for his grandmother as a child. And so I think it's a challenge to make an era that's different relatable. And I think the closer it gets to today and the more different it is from what we would expect, the more time needs to be put in on that, just so that readers don't go, oh, really? You can't be serious. And well, yeah, serious. So I think the groundwork for that needs to be laid.
All right. Tamsin, what about Wild West?
So I don't know if you guys know this, but there's a really, really big group of people who really love Billy the Kid. And they know that history. They know it backwards and forwards. And if they're going to want to read what I'm writing, I need to make sure that I am on the nose as much as possible. So that was my first concern. Not only that, but because I was in Lincoln and talking with people and talking with the historians there, and I had made the decision that I was going to keep history as exact as possible, save for 3 items, 3 people that normally would die in history because the fantasy I'm using, they don't. Other than that, as far as the history we know at the time, I've kept everything along the lines of what I have learned from historians and research, which, by the way, really noble choice, really difficult sometimes to make for your writing. But to help, so everybody who really loves Billy knows all that. So I didn't have to worry so much about that part, even though I do want that to be accessible to people who don't know anything about Billy. So one of the things I really focused on was the language. I made sure that the dialogue is something I do well. It's something that I enjoy, probably from years of theater and scripts and that. And I made sure that the dialogue felt a little more contemporary. There is some colloquialisms in there for during the dialogue sections, but I didn't put that throughout any description. And I also just made sure that the friendships felt real. I made sure that you, as the reader, I wanted them to fall in love with Billy and Rick, and Dick Brewer and all those guys the way I did. And I thought the best way to do that would be to really let them see the friendship that they had, the camaraderie, and how they had each other's backs in this, and their devotion to one another. And so that is sort of what, other than, of course, the murder mystery part of it, which always is interesting to people, no matter what time period. but I wanted to bring people in to the human aspect of it. And that never goes away as being something to pull anyone in. And so I really focused a lot on that. I had someone who read the second book and were like, man, this feels like a love, like this is your love story in a way, not in, but like there's so much love here for these people and for this town. And they said, that's what this feels like. It's almost like an homage to them. And I said, you are correct. Thank you. Glad that came across. So that was sort of the thing that I liked to focus on the most, to make sure that someone today, and there's also things in there are lines that if you're part of fandom that I've thrown in, that if you catch them, you'll be like, wait a minute, because it's definitely, so there's one in the third book. Is anybody here ever, I'm sure some people have heard the musical Rent.
Mhm.
Okay, there's a song called Santa Fe. And they're about to go to Santa Fe, and he sings on our way. He says, I just say that he sings on our way to Santa Fe, and I don't say the tune. But like, if you know Rent, and you'll hear it, and you're like, so there's little things like that I throw in there from other types of fandom and lines. I think there's a nod to Firefly somewhere in the series. So like, there are little things in there I threw in for people who are fans of urban fantasy and other things at the conventions that we speak at as well. So I always kind of hope that people catch them, and if they glaze over it and they don't know, that's okay too. They're there for the people who catch it and they laugh and they move on. So those are the kind of things I really focused on to bring it into a modern audience, other than of course also writing in 1949 and dealing with things that are a little more, they still talk about how her murder wasn't solved in Las Cruces. So that also brings people into the story as well.
Jean Marie.
Okay, well, one of the things that I think is most important, I agree with everything that everybody said, with the caveat that we have no idea how people spoke in the past. We can look at their letters, we can look at the plays, but those, just like our dialogue, are filtered speech. And so, you have probably more breadth and possibility than you might think in terms of how people spoke, as long as you are true to the expressions of the period. There is a romance writer who insists on having people talk about being angsty in the late 19th century. One of these days, if I'm ever seeing her in person, she may find herself very dead. But that's because I've got an epigrapher for a husband who studies the history of words. But one of the things that I find most important is the selection of the incident you use. If you were to go back to 1814, Washington, D.C., even your heroes, your historical heroes, would have attitudes and views that you would find disgusting, appalling, and not to be born. So you have to select very carefully your view of a situation and the characters you choose to populate that view, so as not to destroy anyone's vision of the past, and at the same time not appall them in the present. And one of the reasons that I chose the characters I did in Cooking Up a Storm was because they were not the ones who would express those attitudes. They, by virtue of who they were, would be free of them. But it's a delicate dance, because, okay, Winston Churchill, everybody's favorite hero until Trump decided he was his favorite hero. But if you look at Winston Churchill, you find out that he was responsible for a veritable genocide in the Indian subcontinent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And, so you have to be really, really careful who you choose to put in your historical fiction, and how you choose what incidents you choose to present them in. And I think that's a very important thing, to allow people to enter a historical world and not be horrified or appalled by it. But to make sure that it's something that we want to look at in 21st century America.
Good point.
Mark, now you mentioned the language issue. Was that the hardest part you had to deal with?
So, well, again, having narrowed these down and sort of curated the collection, the primary author is a guy who didn't really have as much rougher ethnic references in there. So I don't have much of that to deal with. Mostly my challenges in terms of words are how much of the antique applications to maintain for color, and how many of them just turn up as looking like they're misspelled. So in the late 19th century, compound words were frequently two words, like to and morrow, and or hyphenated. And so I tend to leave those because I think they're color. Other words that are just sort of odd spellings that may or may not have even been standard at the time, I changed to something more modern. But I try not to really modernize the works. I want it to speak in those ways. I mean, those are, I guess, arguably historical fiction, but they were written before they were historical. And so I don't want to lose that. The part of these that I do write is I write a half a dozen pages of a sort of a contextual history setup for the story at the front. One that I'm challenged with right now that I haven't brought out yet, it came out at the end of 1890, and it has some sort of central casting, not very well crafted Indian characters, Native American characters in it. And sadly, this thing came out in the same month as Wounded Knee happened. And so, it's in the series. I kind of need to try to do the whole series if I can, and I've been really troubled with it. But I think the real angle I'm going to work on is that what, in fact, would a writer have heard about any of this stuff in New York versus what really happened that we know now. So I'm going to try to explore that a bit in the intro to try to set it up and make it more understandable and like that. So anyway, that's the sort of stuff I deal with on them, and sort of editing and curating. Does that answer your question?
Oh, definitely. David, how about you?
So it wouldn't be a convention panel with me on it if I didn't spend at least some time talking about point of view. Point of view is the way we as authors communicate with our readers. We express emotion and sensation and sense of action and everything through the perceptions of our point of view characters. And so the way that I take a time period that is going to be alien to a 21st century audience and make it accessible is through my character's perceptions, and through his familiarity with all the things that are going to be unfamiliar to my readers. And that means doing a lot of research and familiarizing myself with the way Boston would have looked in 1765 or 68 or 69, which one of the books you're reading at the time, and finding ways for Ethan's perceptions. Ethan Cale is my hero. His perceptions to make entry into that culture and that physical environment easier for my audience. And so, to the extent that I can make him a trusted narrator, to the extent that his reactions to all the human things that have nothing to do with the historical stuff and everything to do with his passions, his sense of danger, his sense of belonging in that place. Everything I can do to humanize him enables me to communicate the historical stuff to my readers, and that's what I strive to do. I don't know if I'm making that clear or not, but that's my thinking about it. Is point of view is my entry to getting my readers involved in all the historical stuff that's kind of arcane. And if it's not arcane to Ethan, then it's not going to end up being arcane to my readers as they familiarize themselves with the book.
Okay, perfect. Piper.
I think it's important to try to cultivate a sense of the characters as people who are going through things just like modern day people go through things, and it's just not, because I get my students say, "Oh, 19th century, it's so boring," blah blah blah. I'm like, are you kidding me? So a few little tidbits, few little historical tidbits for them. And so my class, sometimes they would call it historical tea. So the young people like to say drop the tea. It means, gossip, kind of things to try to get them all excited about the fact that there are these things that happen that just like today, like premarital sex and stuff, It was like, Abraham and Mary had to get married. They had to get married. It's like 9 months to the day before a little baby comes along. What happened with that? Stuff like that to try to pull them along. And so that's why I do a similar thing in terms of my stories. Is to not necessarily the history like a backdrop or that it's not important, but just to make sure to highlight those things in terms of the humanity of the characters that readers hopefully will tie into. So.
What are your thoughts of putting in cameos of famous people? Do you do that?
All the time, yeah. Yeah. It's like famous people, maybe not so famous people, so that people can then become aware of the fact that there's this person that did this thing or had a particular connection or whatever. But my historical fiction that'll be out next year with William Morrow hinges on the famous person. It's about Anne Lowe, who was the Black designer who did Jackie Kennedy's wedding dress. This woman was one of the first Black haute couture designers. And Kitty Kelly, with her salacious self, and Jackie O calls her the family seamstress. And it's like, what? This woman did these particular works of art in terms of the way that she was designing not just Jackie's dress, but clothing that meant that, oh my gosh, she created these works of art and is reduced to a family seamstress. In Jackie O, which was like I don't know how much, it was a huge bestseller back in the 70s at least. So like for that, I know and I'm fully aware, and I'm sure William Morrow is going to basically exploit the Kennedy thing so that we can get the Black woman's story in there somehow in terms of, so yeah, the story is very structured along those lines in terms of, but yeah, that involved me. And I was glad to finally have some use for my knowledge of the Kennedys, because I'd been reading for all these years and stuff and never knew when it was going to come in handy.
Are you going to get into the double wedding dress?
The fact that she had to do it twice?
Yeah.
That's how the book starts.
Cool.
Yeah, that's how it's structured. It's structured upon her discovery of the horrific flood in her shop. The thing I did that I hopefully tried to entice readers to read further on was that maybe someone in her life was responsible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that I had heard whispers to that effect. Yeah, because
yeah, and but I also saw in research where they said somebody up above her had been a little bit too tipsy for a party that night before, and they were in the bathtub, and the bathtub overflowed down to her studio.
Yeah, but that
So,
doesn't seem likely because if it's going to overflow that badly, you'd
I'm
be
just
dead.
saying there are other stories out there.
Yeah, I know. That's
Like it's never been thought or discussed that maybe someone in her life did it, you
yeah.
know, by way of sabotaging this most important commission of her life.
Right.
And yeah, so I did do that.
Cool.
Where as the story goes on, you meet the people in her life and hopefully, you know, wonder who was it that did it. She had to redo the dress and the bridesmaids' dresses within like 5 days.
Yeah.
Wow.
It was,
Wow.
and then of course she couldn't tell them that had happened, so she took a loss on it.
Yeah. But she went on.
Oh yeah,
She persisted.
There was no question of that. That had to happen in terms of her finishing the commission and getting it. Oh, and then when she got it up there and she opened the door at Hammersmith Farm, the butler dude that opens the door told her to go to the back.
Oh, man.
Yeah.
And she said, if I have to go to the back door with these dresses, Miss Kennedy and the bridesmaids, Miss Bouvier and the bridesmaids will not be having dresses for the wedding. So.
Pick your poison. Which is it gonna be?
So you guys have all pointed out how important research is when you're writing historical. And I'll start with you, Tamsin. I know you've touched on what you did. Could you go a little more in detail of specifically for your Billy the Kid? Because I know you've done more than just online research.
Yeah. So when I lived in New York, one of the things I thought of was, you know, I need to actually go and see. I've never been out west. So I decided I'd go and I reached out to the Historical Society for Lincoln and found someone who would give me a tour and take me around and introduce me to people. And so now the entire town knows me as Tamsin instead of, like, I would have stopped her and said, you can introduce me under my non-pen name. I never had the chance. And so when friends go with me who know me under both, I'm like, bye. Everyone there does not remember. So one of the things I did that was maybe different is that there's a lot of historians for that particular part of history, which is not very long. The Lincoln County War really only starts in February of 1878, and it's over by the end of July. I mean, Billy still fights the fight until he passes away a few years later. But as far as the actual battle is concerned and the actual war dates, so it's really short. But there's a lot of people who write on it. So one of the things I had to do was find out, who do historians consider to be the author of most repute? Who do they feel is the most spot on with what they write? Because I have a lot of books. They are up above on that. So those are all the history books that I ended up, because I have a problem and I buy lots of books. I'm sure none of you have this problem, right? But I was informed that Frederick Nolan was the main person, and I reached out to him. And I also got a bunch of his stuff and I read it and took notes, and I made, and I sat down, and if I wanted to get the history right, I then would make decisions. And then I would meet with Drew Gomber. Drew Gomber is considered one of the historians that's still alive that knows the most. In fact, he has been commissioned to write a book about it, and it is written, and I'm not sure when it comes out because it takes time, but so I would meet with him and we would talk about certain things in history. And I'd say, hey, so there are these different items that got said that happened here, and they're different. I think it's this. It's what I was thinking of going with. What do you, and we would have a conversation about what we felt was true, what was not, how much was hyperbole, how much was, hey, he said, she said stuff. Because gossip is still a big thing. It's just a different way back then. They used to write, instead of Facebook, they used to write letters to each other and send them to get in the paper, and they'd yell at each other back and forth this way. And so, so yeah, I wanted to meet with historians and who really knew the period. And I also got to know the townspeople, people who run the shops there. And I sat down with them and got to know what they knew about Billy. And I paid attention to, I went to different events there and listened to people who love Billy the Kid and who go to these events and why they love him and what it is about the stories. And I just started asking lots of questions. So tell me about your experience. And the more people I met with, the more of a full person him and the rest of the regulators became. And so, and as I said, I fell in love with the people in the state, and I moved here. But the people are really what make Lincoln amazing. And so this year I decided, since no one really can go see them, I'm doing a series called Meet Lincoln. You can go to my website, tamsinsilver.com. We'll do the plug. And there's a whole section on videos, and I am putting up videos where I sit down and I speak to the people who are running all the areas of Lincoln, and you get to know them. And so they are really important to me, and the books are dedicated to them and their love of how they've kept Billy alive all these years. So, so that's a big grouping of many things, I guess, I did that to help me get into the mindset to write these.
Jean Marie?
Well, it varies, okay? Sometimes research is a matter of finding every damn book you can get your hands on and doing a timeline by comparing letters from the period as it was in for Cooking Up a Storm. The odd point of that was it was a secret history with magic of the burning of Washington. And the starting point was a travel brochure that mentioned there were 2 hurricanes within 12 hours.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Trying to run that down wound up being something you couldn't do with standard histories. It wound up being something where you had to get letters of the period, including those written by Dolly Madison and others, and basically photocopy them and cut it up so you had a timeline, because there was no other way to make this thing make sense. However, if you're doing a short story and it's not part of a larger world that is going to have novels in it, the kind of research you do is much more glancing. And it's also sometimes determined by what you can get your hands on. There are a lot of high-level books on the Ming Dynasty, especially the Emperor Yongle and Zheng Hua, who was the model for Sinbad the Sailor. But if you want to get into the life of the Ming Dynasty, it's not in English. I basically plunked down a ridiculous amount of money for a book that was basically excerpts from historical Ming documentation on various sociological aspects of it. And it was part of a large Chinese encyclopedia of the sociology of the Ming Dynasty. But it was written in Chinese originally, and it was translated by people for whom English is obviously a second language. And yeah, not as good, not as well researched as the 1814 thing. And then 1938. Well, my dad was around New York then. So a lot of it is based on dad's stories and trying to cross-check dad's stories because he was Irish. And then basically, okay, we can't tell how people spoke because everything you see, whether it be a letter or a book or anything else, is filtered. But you can get a feel about how they wanted to appear they sounded from all of those Warner Brothers movies of the period. True. So when I do that particular series, those are the things I draw on most heavily. Yeah, I'm going after big ticket items like the destruction of the Hindenburg or the Joe Louis Max Schmeling fight. And ultimately there will be War of the Worlds and the Long Island Express and ultimately the 1939 World's Fair. But basically that is not as closely researched as something where historicity is very, very important. And because there are not too many people around to remember the 30s firsthand anymore.
So Mark, go
Yes,
ahead.
sir.
I was just going to say World Fair. You have someone who can talk to someone about the first Chicago World Fair?
No, not the first
Oh.
Chicago, the
Okay.
1939 World's Fair, the World of Tomorrow,
York.
the source of that awful line that opens up Plan 9 from Outer Space.
Ah,
We are all concerned about the future because the future is where we're going to live. And it was in their promotional copy.
wow. I thought maybe you had some diaries or something that was,
No,
because
no, no, no.
that's one of the things I have to write about
1939.
coming
Right,
up.
right.
I had hopes, dang it.
Sorry.
Okay, it's fine.
Tamsin, have you read Devil in the White City?
Oh, I have a copy and I have it audiobook and I have it in paperback, and it's on my list as I start working on that time period. Once I turn
Okay.
in the last
It's-
book to Falstaff, then I can focus over.
Yeah. Okay.
But yeah, I've got that one and a couple others. But if you think of anything else, please let me know.
I will.
So Mark, even though you didn't write these, I'm assuming that research was very important. You said you have to kind of give a background so that
Well,
people
I
can
try
understand
to
it.
write something so people have a little more understanding of what they're about to read. But yeah, I've got probably a couple of dozen books, mostly from Gilded Age New York. Some are period, some are modern printings. Um, I draw on those as well as internet stuff, and of course, I've got probably a couple of thousand original books and publications. But yeah, I try to get a good knowledge of all that, so I can present context and people understand what these stories really were. I mean, they were essentially the TV of the 1880s. They're no better or worse than your popular TV shoot 'em ups and stuff. And the ones I use are not westerns. They're generally urban detective and crime fiction. And I think those translate better to modern readers. And so I've got artifacts. I mean, I've always collected artifacts. I've got a number of dark lanterns. If anybody wonders what a dark lantern really is, I'm sure this historical bunch knows all about them. But I've got a page that basically tells people what the hell a dark lantern is, and various other artifacts I can use. They're photo props, and they're also things that tell me what people were employing at the time. So yes, I do research these things to try to be able to introduce context, and the books they're meant for fun reading. I fortunately know a lot of academics who, because this popular literature has become a go-to course in many universities, and these people have been very helpful to me as resources. But I don't have any footnotes or any of that. I try to make them just read as a normal book. And at the end, I've got notes and glossary and that sort of thing. So if that helps.
Perfect. David, how about you?
Well, it was very helpful having gotten my PhD, because I was familiar with the literature before I started researching the Thief Taker books. Now, one of the things I found very quickly, and I knew this was going to be an issue, is that most of the books that graduate students today, and at the time when I was getting my PhD, are reading are books that are responding to other history books. It's a lot of kind of infighting within the field, and not just fighting, but also building on other people's research and academic conversations that are continuing through volumes that are. And what I needed was not a discussion of so-and-so's theory of social history of Boston, I need somebody who could tell me when the first street lights were put in and what the city looked like. And so I ended up having to go back to read historiography, not from the late 20th century, but rather from the earliest years of the 20th century and back into the 19th century, when people were still interested in just reading books about what the city actually looked like. There's this one book that I use every time I'm writing a new Thief Taker story or a novel, written by a guy named Samuel Adams Drake. And it's basically a walking tour of Boston, where he's walking around all these neighborhoods and saying, oh yes, that's so-and-so's house. And back in 1684, it looked like this. And then it was renovated 20 years later, and then it was used by so-and-so. And eventually, Samuel Adams had dinner there in April of what, and, stuff like that that's gold. That is solid gold for when you're trying to recreate a historical city in a novel. The other thing I'll say is that, as fun as it is to say, oh God, the internet, you can't believe anything you find on the internet. Some of the gems that I discovered in doing research for the Thief Taker books were straight off the internet. I'll give you two examples. One of them was, there's a character named Stephen Greenleaf, who was the sheriff of Suffolk County in Boston in the 1760s and 70s. And try as I might, I could not get any physical description of him. I found lots of references to him, but I couldn't find, and I was doing all these searches and, Google pages where I'm like on the 27th Google page of a particular search, just going through minutia. And all of a sudden, there is a pen and ink drawing of Stephen Greenleaf. And it was like angels singing. I mean, this just this moment of discovery. It was I have never been so excited to see a pen and ink drawing of an ugly man in my entire life, but there he was. And then the other thing was a document I found that was put out by an architecture firm that specialized in historical reconstruction. And they had worked on King's Chapel, which is one of the oldest chapels in Boston, that is the scene of a bunch of scenes in all the Thief Taker novels. It recurs again and again. And they had done bore sampling, and they were able to reconstruct the color of the paint inside the chapel by decade through the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. And I mean, again, talk about gold. So yeah, you have to beware of stuff that you find on the internet, but every once in a while you find stuff on the internet that is just, I mean, it's an incredible tool if you use it with some care.
I found something like that. I didn't know what Cricket had a sister, and sister married this guy. And I needed to know what he looked like for Billy comes in and he's interviewing them about the murder. And I was like, oh gosh, I really don't get this wrong. There are people alive today who are related. And it was magic. All of a sudden I found this photo of him from online from a newspaper or whatever it was with them later in life, but it showed, like, it was showing them older, but then it showed just all of a sudden their wedding photo. And I was like, yes, because literally this thing takes place like a year after they were married. So I was like, so excited.
Yep.
But yeah, sometimes you find things that help.
Yep. All right. Piper, how about you?
You mean in terms of like serendipitous discoveries, or
just what you did for your research?
Oh, you mean what I've done for that? Well, there was a young woman who unfortunately passed away, who was doing, she was getting her major in the textile industry. She is at the Corcoran School of Art that is under the auspices of George Washington University. She had written her thesis on Anne Lowe and had been maintaining a blog for some time. about some of the things, some of the tidbits she had discovered, etc. But the library at George Washington University had it on lockdown because it had been optioned. And they had thought something was going to come of it. In terms of Anne Lode's life story. And of course, I wanted to get that, and it was in Washington, D.C., and so I went up there to get it, and I had requested it enough time for them to give it to me. So I was like, not that I, was going to Washington, D.C. for nothing. I love it. I love going up there. So it wasn't actually a problem at all in terms of going up there because I enjoyed myself, but I didn't get to do with the thing that I'd gone up there to do. Even though when I stepped off of the metro and realized the fact that, oh my gosh, this place is somewhat like a little bit of a shrine to Jackie Bouvier because that's where she went to school. It was so funny. It seems serendipitous that here I come off the subway and there's the dorm and the bust and all of that of her there. So I went back home, just went and get it. But then they emailed me a couple days later and said, if you promise not to use this or send it off to anybody else or whatever in some kind of bad way, we'll send it to you. So I was very fortunate to get it somehow, so that, of course, her interests in Anne's work were far more along the lines of, the fabrics that she was using, the way she put the dress together, etc. But it did come to show how precise and clever she was in terms of the work that she was doing. And of course, trying to reconfirm the contours of her life. I want to search for the Mike Douglas Show episode of Christmas Eve, 1964, if anyone has any ideas. During a pandemic, how to obtain a said episode of the Mike Douglas Show, because she was interviewed on it, and it's the only footage of her talking and stuff that I could,
Would the Library of Congress have something on those talk shows, or did they just take a sampling of them?
I had thought I'd gone to what is it now? It's not it used to be the National Museum of Television in New York, but they're closed, whatever. So I hadn't tried the Library of Congress because I was firmly convinced that because Margaret had obtained it, this original researcher, she had obtained it. So somebody out there has it.
Yeah.
In terms
I know
of
they have a huge video vault in Northern Virginia, but I've never really gained access to it because I've never needed it,
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, so, but I would suggest that would be my thought on it. It might be hopeless, but you never can tell. If it had been 70s or later, there was this woman who started taping TV.
Yes, I saw. Was it a POV episode on her?
Yeah. I mean, talk about a resource.
Yes, yes. That was quite an interesting episode. We're talking about how she's. I mean, you remember how VCRs were, where you only had like.
Yeah, and she was taping everything.
It's like, oh my God.
40 years of tapes.
Yeah. Quite an interesting resource. But yeah, 1964.
That was before VCRs, really.
And I know it, like I said, Margaret has it. It had to exist because if anybody's seen the movie One Night in Miami, they had a little snippet of Sam Cooke. I think it was his 1964 appearance on the Mike Douglas Show. Exists. So.
They had kinescopes then, which was a method of shooting film from a TV monitor.
And no, in the 60s, kinescopes had already been superseded by video.
Okay.
Honestly, lived through it.
Oh yeah, magnetic. Believe me, I was there. I mean, synchronized video machines, but you're right.
No, videotapes, because the kinescopes, oh God, the quality on that is awful.
No, it's
you
terrible.
Wonder how, I guess people were just so enchanted to have the boxes in their homes.
Well, yeah.
All right. So, Nancy, what do you do for your research? Yours is more fantasy, but it's based on a historical period.
Right.
Correct?
It's the first book takes place in the reign of Charles II, which is also known as the Restoration era. Jean Marie and I kind of bonded over our admiration for Charles II. And I found a couple of social histories of that period. Costume book put out by the Victoria and Albert Museum. The National Trust puts out books about what people ate and kind of how they lived. It's kind of all mixed up in together in some of those books. And so I had those, and then having done the deep dive into the Richard III thing, I sort of already knew what I wanted to use, and I had a shelf of books about Richard III and the controversy about him. Because the theme that runs through the trilogy is the family trying to clear Richard's name because an ancestor of theirs helped someone else murder the princes in the Tower, who were the sons of Edward IV, and Richard was blamed. And so I found different people who figured into the events of 1483 and either used documents that existed or created documents that might have existed. And I will just say here, along the lines of propaganda, I really don't think anybody in 1483 murdered them. I think they survived into the reign of Henry VII, but that's a whole other panel. So we won't
Yes, Josephine Tay. Yes.
not just Josephine Tay, but like I said, I'm not going to derail us by going into all of that. So that was very helpful. And then I read Regency historical romances, but I never tried to write one because I didn't feel like I had anything to bring to it. And when I thought, well, if I'm going to do it with magic and tie it into Richard III, that would be different. So that's what I did. And I had to do a lot of research into the Battle of Waterloo. I would really love to go to Waterloo now and walk the ground, but aside from that, it's going to be very expensive. I'm not getting on a plane for a while, so that's not going to happen. But there are a lot of books about the Battle of Waterloo, and I read enough of them to realize that there was some controversy about what happened when in the final hours of the battle. And the nice thing about fiction is you can just say, well, this works best for my story, so I picked this. But I felt better knowing that there were differing accounts and differing views, so that I was on more solid ground to say, I picked this one because. And actually, getting back to the first book for a minute, I picked the reign of Charles II because 1674 was the year the bones that are purported to be those of Edward IV's sons were discovered at the Tower of London. And I used that to springboard the time travel plot. So that was the natural period for it to start. And there are more social histories of Regency England than, in my view, any sane person would possibly want to read. So I read a couple of those, looked for social conventions, did a little research on dueling, and discovered that there was a different set of rules for duels. It was not always the Marquis of Queensberry. And there were actually rules for a fist fight in the period. And of course, I'm blanking on what they were, but I found them on the internet. I just was looking up dueling rules and this popped up. And I thought, oh, well, I can use that. And so that was very handy. And then, of course, there are more costume books about Regency clothing than any writer writing a book would need. And so then when we moved to World War II, I've been fascinated with Dunkirk and the Battle of Britain most of my adult life, because there were so many junctures where if one thing went differently, the Allies were toast. And I'd read so much about the military history that I didn't think about social history. And that was a huge mistake. So it's, and I know not to assume. I was a history major. I know not to assume, but I assumed. And, I'm just lucky it was my friends who shot me in the foot instead of editors or readers. And so then I went back and I actually used the internet, because there are a lot of sites that have firsthand accounts of people who lived through the war. Because 1939, early 1940, rationing wasn't in full swing. It was just getting started. And they were just in the process of putting bomb shelters in Hyde Park and putting in gardens. And so it was really fascinating to me to go back and see the social history lying under the political and military history. And I actually was able to go to Dover, which is where that was the headquarters of Coastal Command, and the Dunkirk evacuation was coordinated from there. And I happened to be there in 2015, which was the 75th anniversary of the Dunkirk evacuation. And they have tunnels in the cliffs that were used as the headquarters for Coastal Command during the war. And you can take a tour of the tunnels. If you're claustrophobic, I don't recommend spending very much time in there, but it was really, really interesting. And they had done this wonderful multimedia show in honor of the 75th anniversary. So if I'd come a year earlier, I wouldn't have gotten to see it. And a friend and I went down and walked on the beach, and we kind of looked at the harbor. But we were thinking, in this age of people who like to stage unexpected attacks, they might not appreciate us walking into the port of Dover and just taking bunches of pictures of everything. And so we kind of did that. What can we see from here? And actually from the castle, you can see a good bit of the port when you look down on it. And there are a lot of websites dedicated to the Dunkirk evacuation and the use of trains to move everybody out, because the Royal Navy went over to Dunkirk along with civilian assistance, loaded everybody up and brought them back. But once they stepped off the ships at Dover, it was the Army's job to get them to various bases around the country. And that kind of turned into a little rabbit hole for me. I mean, at one point my husband said, "This is just chapter 1, right?" And I'm like, well, yeah, but it's so cool because they did this and they did that, and people down the road and they were making food. And he went, "This is just chapter 1, right?" So, well, yeah, but it was interesting. And the nice thing about research is you can always find a way to use it somewhere else. Once you've done it and it's in your head or on your bookshelf, you can always use it somewhere else. So that was fun. And despite my chagrin over not having researched social history, which I'm sharing so that other people will not make that mistake, it was a lot of fun to research that book. And when I started talking to friends in London in the 1960s, a friend of mine lived in, I forget the name of it, it's an area on the fringes, not in Bloomsbury, but near it. And they didn't have a kitchen in their flat. The building had one kitchen for the entire building and one bathroom for the entire building. And I just never would have thought that in the 1960s in one of the major cities in the world. But as one of my friends pointed out to me, you have a building that's built in the 1890s. You got to retrofit that for plumbing, for a kitchen for every unit, for a bathroom for every unit. Think about how much that's going to cost. And the material I found on new construction in the 1930s, the houses had interior running water and interior bathrooms, as opposed to, I mean, they actually, the bathrooms in a lot of the rural areas were out the kitchen door. It wasn't an outhouse at the back of the property, but it was out the kitchen door, and they still had night soil men who came by to empty the pit, as they had done in the reign of Charles II in London, in rural England in the 1940s. So it was really educational for me. And I don't mind being wrong about something as long as I can find the right answer before it goes public and embarrasses me hugely. And then I get to learn something. So why wouldn't I like that? So I mostly use books. I've used the internet some, and I've been fortunate to have people I could impose upon and email them, go, "So what about this?" And luckily they answer.
Right. That's perfect. And I know we could probably take another hour and a half going down all the rabbit holes for research. But I'm going to go ahead and end here. Have everyone go around one more time. Let us know where they can find you on the internet. And I'll start with you, Jean Marie.
Okay, you can find me at jeanmarieward.com or here at ConTinual. But yeah, if you want to know about my fiction, go to jeanmarieward.com. There's information on all my books and links to everything, all the places that I jabber.
All right, perfect. Mark.
I mentioned earlier, I've got the bargain WordPress thing. So it's darklanternTales.wordpress.com, I believe. But if you search Dark Lantern Tales within quotes, you'll find it.
All right, thank
All
you.
3 words.
David.
I have the 2 web addresses up here, davidbco.com and dbjackson-author.com. And you can find me on Twitter and Facebook as well. Yeah, I'm everywhere, man. I'm everywhere.
All right. Piper.
I am piperhuguley.com. That's my blog that's going to be overhauled pretty shortly here. But I'm on Facebook at Piper Huguley, and I am on Twitter at Piper Huguley as well.
All right. Perfect. Nancy?
My website is nancynorthcott.com. I spend more time on Twitter than is probably good for me, and I'm at Nancy Northcott. You can connect with me there. And I have a Facebook author page, Nancy Northcott Author, where I pop in on occasion.
All right. And finally, Tamsin.
As mentioned, tamsinsilver.com. I've started a newsletter. You can subscribe right at the top, you'll see. And I send out things for people there before they go public. I'm also on Facebook more than I should be, and I'm under Tamsin Silver there. I have a day job that takes up time, so I don't get to play on Twitter as much, but I'm at Tamsin Silver there as well. And if you really are interested in Billy the Kid history, I have a Facebook page for the Curse of Billy the Kid. You can look up that, or you can look up Billy the Kid Rides Again.
And I want to thank all of you for coming in and everyone for viewing. See you guys next time.
Thank you.
Bye.
All right, thanks, Jason.
Thank you, Jason.
Yep.